Greetings, welcome back to CS195 Web Development. This is week 6, CSS Layouts, part 1. First lesson, width, height, and overflow. So last lesson we talked about using more than one class on a tag, and then how would you separate each class to accomplish this? So think about that. Our objective of this lesson is to resize elements and then to understand how to handle the text or anything inside when it's too large, when it's the element around it's resized. So basically, as we're shrinking an element, anything that inside might overflow is the key word for this. So our criteria, this success criteria, is demonstrating adding a CS rule that changes the width of an element and then use overflow to adapt the text inside of that element. So what does this all mean? Well, let's go ahead and watch the con video and then try it out.
When we use divs, it's often because we want to divide our page into different boxes, resize those boxes, and move them around. It takes a good eye for design to decide exactly how to lay out a page so it looks good, but right now, we're going to ignore the goal of making a page look good and just show you how to change stuff up. Let's resize the official info div. By default, a div takes up 100% of the available width. That's why you see the gray box going across the whole page. But maybe I only want it to take up 300 pics. Well, I'll add another property to the CSS rule up here, width:300 pics. That worked, but let's do something more interesting. Let's use percentage width and say that the div will always take up 70% of the available width. Now, the text is constrained to that smaller box, and the div has gotten taller. If we really want to, we can also constrain the height of the box with the height property, height:180 pics. Okay, something funny happened. The gray box resized to 180 pixels, but the text is overflowing outside of that gray box. Why did that happen? That is because of a property we call overflow. The default value for overflow is visible.
So if you hopefully saw it, I highlighted it as you had, but see how there's this Wikipedia read more? And all the text inside of this box is now overflowing past this gray box, which you'll see this a lot. She uses it, I'll use it. Sometimes you give an element a background color just so you can see it where the actual edges are. And as we move into different pieces of this formatting, we'll see more and more why it's important to understand where the outline of something actually is.
Which means that the element resizes, but the content flows outside of it, which looks a bit silly. What other options do we have for overflow? Well, we could try hidden. That cuts the content off, trimming it at the border. That's not what we want though, because then our viewers won't be able to read all of our amazing official info. We could also try auto, which tells the browser to add scroll bars if the content overflows. Now I can scroll around inside the box to see the text. If we want, we can be even more specific and specify different overflow properties for each direction. For example, we wanted to overflow with scroll bars in the Y direction, up and down, we'll just overflow Y auto. But then if we want to trim it in the X direction, we can say overflow X hidden.
But she doesn't do a great job explaining that because you don't actually see the X hidden at all. When that comes into play is when one word is too far. So see, now you can't see that I typed all of this over here because it's over here. Otherwise, its default is to wrap. So if it's not too long, it's just if it's too long, it's just going to go down below. Except for when it itself is too long. This is what we do. So if she just had the auto on this, and again, if you don't have to do the auto, but now we have that actual wrap, right? So that is when this actually applies, at least in the X position. So.
Okay. Be careful anytime you're using overflow because scroll bars can get really annoying for the user, especially scroll bars within scroll bar.
I mean, you're already kind of looking at this. We have a scroll bar here. And then if she had more text, in theory, there could be a scroll bar here. And then there's a scroll bar here. So there's quite a bit of scroll bars on here.
Avoid those if you can. Now going back to width height, we can actually use width and height for all sorts of elements, like our images. Now that you know CSS, you can use the width height CSS properties instead of the width height attributes. Let's make this cat image a bit bigger by giving it an ID, cute cat, deleting the attribute, and going up to our style rule. And let's say cute cat and width 120 pixels. Just like before with attributes, it's best to only specify the width or the height and let the browser figure out the best value for the other dimension. Otherwise, we'll have a squashed kitty. Well, okay, that sounds kind of awesome, so let's just try that for a second. Height 40 pixels. Squashed kitty. Yay!
Yay. Okay, anyway, so we're going to go ahead and try this out. So head back over to Trinket, come down here. I'm going to full screen it. You don't need to if you don't need to, but again, follow along. Make this so you can see it, and we'll probably move this around a little bit as we go to see how some of this works. But again, let's look at this. We talked about how divs work, so all three of those paragraphs are inside of it. I'm going to show you some interesting stuff that'll come in handy as well later. So let's go ahead and add a rule to the paragraphs. I'm going to give them a background, and this is going to help also with the understanding of divs, right? So I'm going to use that background of red. And notice how they just go around the paragraph. So that is the outer edges of the paragraph. Size goes around everything. So let's go ahead and indent into the right spot. Let's give it a background so we can see what it looks like. Background blue. And I'm going to remove this one real quick to show you that it does encompass all of that. But all that blue that you see is still inside of the div, right? So this is why sometimes you add backgrounds and then just remove them later so you can see what's going on. But let's go ahead and start playing around with the width. So width 50%. So this is 50% of the object that it's in, all right? So I'm going to go ahead and show this, and you can see how, again, it's 50% of that object. You can also see how the text starts to wrap a little bit as we do this. So I'm going to add more text to this just simply by copying three's a crowd a bunch of times, right? So I'm going to copy this a bunch of times. So I have a bunch of space, so then I can shrink this down a little bit so we can see it. So we're going to go ahead and do height. And here we go. So again, when it turns purple, you spelled it right. Let's make it go 150 px. All right, so that's the height of this thing. Remember, its default is to overflow, right? Its default is to overflow. So let's go ahead and get rid of this red so we can see that it did indeed overflow. Again, this is why it's important to have these backgrounds on so you can turn them on and off, and you can see that it did. It's overflowed past the edge of this. I'm going to leave this off for now. And I keep using the word overflow because that's the one we use to then change the overflow. So remember, hidden just makes it go away. Not super useful. Auto gives us a scroll bar. So now we have a scroll bar. And again, this will change. You can see the scroll will change as we change the size of it. All right, the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and delete both of those. So we get the idea, right? I set the width and the height, and there's more data in it. So if I just get rid of the height and the overflow, then it's just going to take up as much as it needs to take up. All right, so the height, getting rid of the height does that. The overflow, you just don't need it after that point. So again, you see it just kind of accommodates this. So we're going to go ahead and then try one thing. We're going to add the background back to this, because there's no overflow. And it's very important to understand that when you set height and width and center align, we talked about this before, we'll talk about it again, you are doing that based on whatever element's in. So right, the paragraph is inside of the div. The div is already 50%. So if I make this width 50%, it's 50% again of the element it's in. 50% of the elements it's in. So in this case, it happens to be 25% of the whole screen because it's already in something that's 50% and it's 50% of that. So this is important to understand. When I tell you, or you're trying to figure out something is 50%, it's 50% of the object that it's in. You might see this on a quiz or a test. When you set the width to 50%, or you set the width period, it's 50% or whatever the percent is of the object it's in, right? So technically this is not 50% of the page. And you'll see this a lot if you get weird results, kind of like when I said center. If I go ahead and center this, text align center, oops, spell it right helps. Again, it's centered on the object that it's in. So it's centered on this 1/4 of the page because of all the other changes we made. So this is one thing I see a lot of students make mistakes when they're trying to do divception, have elementception, having elements inside of elements, which you're going to. As we go into the advanced layouts, we're going to have elements inside of elements. So it's important to understand how this works. All right, so that is the end of this. Don't forget to do your practice challenge and journal entry. We'll see you next lesson.